Hello, my name is Emma and I am here to talk to you today about attendance, participation and collaboration in the undergraduate studio. Orr and Shreve describe the studio space as one of the signature pedagogies of art and design, and I can't agree enough. Studio space is, as they say, a unique and important aspect of a creative education. They go on to note that the studio has been a central part of organised learning in the visual arts for more than a century, and that students create this social learning environment. Ideally, the studio should be an active, busy and social space where students collaborate and work together and develop their ideas alongside one another. I genuinely think it is one of the most important and rewarding parts of a university creative education when it's done right. So why does the studio that I oversee on BA User Experience Design often look like this during our open access periods? There's no one there. There's no one using the space. And what I set out to find out with my action research project was, why is this, and is there anything that we can do to make the studio space everything that it could be, to live up to its potential? And why is this a social justice issue? It's maybe easier to understand this if we start to consider some of the reasons that students might not be in that space. Firstly, accessibility. 17.9% of UAL students have a declared disability, so it leaves me wondering whether there is some aspect of our studio that makes it inhospitable to our students. Secondly, class, social and financial status. The studio could, and I think should, provide a haven for students, particularly if their own accommodation is suboptimal, but there are perhaps reasons why the studio might not offer such a welcoming space. And as noted here, pervasive intersectional class inequality is a structural problem endemic to the arts and society at large. So if our studio is reinforcing this structural inequality, is there anything that we can do to change the studio and make it a more accessible space for our students from every perspective? But at this stage, this is all just speculation. So it was time to do some research and find out a bit more about the staff and students who use it. I planned several different types of research: student interviews, staff interviews, a student workshop and a survey. I also originally planned to do observations. Feel free to ask me in the questions later on why I chose not to do this. My first interview was with our studio technician. Some core themes that emerged from my interview with him was that students don't take sufficient ownership of the space, and this may well be because they don't fully understand the space's potential. He also felt that students don't appreciate the value of collaborative work and collaborative discussions, and that encouraging them and supporting them into understanding this might be a key way of getting the studio into more frequent usage. I then did an interview with a disability support advisor because I was curious about what sorts of problems students came to her with when it came to accessing spaces on campus. She emphasised that choice is the gold standard when it comes to allowing students to access spaces, and also that students will always be able to better control their sensory environment at home, and so highlighting to them, as our technician also said, the importance of collaboration and peer learning may emphasise to them that there are things that they can get in the studio that they cannot get at home, even if their home space is actually more comfortable in many ways and always will be. Finally, I did an interview with a neighbouring course leader, and the reason I interviewed him was because his course does have a thriving studio culture, despite being of a very similar size and in a very similar area of the building to ours. He emphasised students' desire lines, how they want to use the space, and how he endeavours to shape the space around what they want. He also noted that comfort means more than just physical comfort, and that making the students feel safe and confident within the space is a vital part of building that sense of ownership and community, and that is what makes students more likely to use a space. After this, I ran a workshop with some of my first year user experience students. I was particularly interested in incorporating participatory drawing into my research, as well as speculative design approaches and fantasy, so that was what this workshop set out to undertake, and I think was one of the most exciting and enjoyable parts of my research to run. We started off by all drawing images of our dream workspace. After those initial drawings, I got the students to add their annotations using post-it notes. We then removed these post-it notes from their drawings and grouped them according to theme, which we determined collectively. This helped us identify which specific areas of the dream studio were areas of concern or things which students would particularly note as being important. User experience design sometimes uses a methodology known as archetypes Typically, this talks about types of people, but I was curious about whether this methodology could actually be applied to types of place. So together, we discussed and came up with 4 archetypal studios based on their work so far in the workshop. I then asked them to mood board these types of studios that we had developed that had emerged from their dream studios, which were all very, very different, but still did fall into these broad categories as we discussed them. Finally, we wondered whether there are any elements that could be pulled from these preferences to create a more flexible space, thinking again about that interview I did earlier on, which emphasised the need for choice. The main outcome was they wanted walls and booths, which is still, admittedly, an insight, albeit maybe not exactly what we can accomplish within our studio space. So the main things I was able to take away from the workshop were that students really value comfort in their workspace, but actually how they define comfort is really, really varied. That said, there are some broad archetypal models for ideal studios, and interestingly, students tended to socially cluster based on their studio preferences. I ran some student interviews. I ran these as a group rather than as individual interviews, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about why I made this decision in the questions later on. So the studio will never be as optimal for solo working as home, which echoed the findings from my interview with the disability advisor earlier. The students all agreed that they can control their home space in a way they never will be able to within the studio. That said, they are excited by the possibility of socialising and sharing their space, but it's hard for them to make that leap to using the space when there's no one there, so it's a bit of a catch-22. Their thoughts were that more scheduled activities in the space, or even just themed times, would help them to plan their weeks, understand a bit more of what the space is for, and potentially build that critical mass of students actually using the space. Finally, I conducted a short survey across all years of the UX course, which mostly focused on the sensory experience of the studio space. The main insights from this echoed a lot of what we'd already found in terms of students preferring to work from home, students wanting lots of space and not too much noise, and also the reflection that students' comfort preferences vary so widely it would be pretty much impossible to completely meet everyone's preferences within one space. So after analysing my research, I developed a series of concepts for my intervention. Feel free to ask me later on about the processes that I used in order to analyse my research and get to this stage. I took these to my course leader so that we could discuss which intervention would be the most effective and practical to test in the time we had available to us. This did lead us to one clear answer, which was noodles. Or more specifically, offering students a free hot meal within the space for all the year groups with the intention of this becoming a regular event. Why was this? Well, it met my research findings, which showed a need for a greater sense of community within the space, the fact that food could be a key way of building social connections, and the students' stated desire for vertical events within the space, meaning events where all the year groups could mingle. And why might this work? Well, it's a good reason for students to stay in the studio through into the afternoon unscheduled times, because what they usually do is have their morning taught sessions, leave to get lunch, and then don't return. Student interviewees explicitly said that the one thing that would make them come to an event was hot food, so this was a really valuable learning, and as mentioned, the students wanted more opportunities to socialise across the year groups. I've got lots more thoughts about food as a social justice issue, which I would love to share in the questions later on, but for now, how did the intervention go? Well, it was busy, it was popular, lots of students came. It was mostly first year students because it was immediately after their session, but we did have some students from years 2 and 3 as well. It was a really popular food choice. Everyone was really enthusiastic about the noodles, and we got a lot of positive feedback. Please feel free to ask me later how I gathered feedback from the intervention. In conclusion, I entered this project thinking there was something about the space itself that we could change, which might improve students' comfort. But as I've learned from this, people's individual definitions of what comfort means are far too subjective for us to ever be able to meet all of them in the space. In fact, some of them are actively contradictory. So no matter how much hypothetical money we were able to throw at the problem, we probably could never truly solve it. And it's good to recognise, actually, that most of the students understand this. As one of my second years noted, design is a really collaborative process and she loved that aspect of it. And actually, it's not going to kill her to sit there and have a chat or work with other people, even if the space is not quite as comfortable as her home office is. The most important drivers for use of the space are actually some of the things that Aura and Shreve told me right at the start of this project. The community, the collaboration, and the connection. That's what the space can and should provide, and it's also what the students want, or at least what many of them want. So this is what we need to make happen. We need to build the community before the community can exist, which again comes back to that catch-22. It is really hard to artificially manufacture community. But by listening to the students, by following their desire lines, as this other course leader mentioned, and designing repeatable events which actually meet their needs and wants, we may begin to foster a sense of community, which could organically bloom the more the students meaningfully connect with one another. There were a number of other recommendations within my research which we are also going to implement. Thank you ever so much for listening, and I welcome any questions.